All right, I'm calling this meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee to order. We'll start with introductions with you, Mr. Gates.
Marilyn Bonsock, Budget.
Mr. Dyson still here?
He'll be attorney. Robert Harris, CFO.
Or Paulson, Municipal Manager.
Eric Croft. Forrest Dunbar.
Dick Training. Ken Steele.
Suzanne McGrath.
Felix Rivera.
Pete Peterson.
Ian Ross.
Thank you. We've been joined by Mr. Dyson, and I believe Mr. Constant will be stepping in momentarily as well. We were supposed to have lunch today because we're in the middle of a 2.5 hour block, but it got delayed apparently. But it should be arriving, so if during the meeting you want to discreetly get up and go get some food, it should be here. So we're going to start with an MOA financial status report from Mr. Harris. Mr. Harris, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The municipality, our financial status is good. We're paying our bills. We have money in the bank. Just did a rating agency trip down to talk to S&P and Fitch, and we're expecting to see those ratings come back to us soon. But we expect that we will reaffirm AAA with Standard & Poor's as well as a AA plus with Fitch. A little bone of contention because Fitch should also give us a AAA, but they are sort of, they don't really do AAAs. They do AA plus. But we'll have a AAA rating. We'll be preserving our credit rating. We remain an outstanding credit risk in the markets.
Thank you. Note for the record, we were joined by Mr. Constant. Are there any questions for Mr. Harris? Okay. Well, great. Then we'll move on to Mr. Wilbur. Are you
Here today,
Miss
Marilyn
Marilyn Bonsock.
Oh, okay, great.
Got the A team.
Go ahead.
So for budget, so it looks like an update on 2017 status. The close is still in progress, so we don't have any new numbers in that regard. For the 2018 budget, 1Q general government operating was approved by your body the last meeting in April. Additionally, the last meeting that was held, I believe we had the approval of the utilities revisions for 2018 operating. The 2018 voter approved bond appropriations. Your body approved both the roads and the parks already, and then on this upcoming meeting will be the remainder of the bonds. So we're hoping that those will, the appropriations for the bonds, excuse me. And then we're working on the development of the 2019 schedule. As part of that, it includes general government operating, utilities operating, and then capital for both general government and utilities. The community council surveys, which is one of the beginning parts of the capital budget process, the surveys from those community councils are due by the end of this month, just so you know. At this time, we have only received only 3 of the 37, and from Government Hill, Mountain View, and Old Stewart's Ocean View. So that's about where we're at.
Okay, Mr. Train.
2017 closeout. The last projection was the end of May or first part of June. What are we looking at now? Do you know when we're going to be done with 2017 so we know what fund balance actually is verifiable out there? Okay, Mr. Harris.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Trainee, I know Lance was hoping that we would have it done by the end of May. I think it's more reasonable to expect it'll be closer to the end of June before we see that. We're still going to step into some of the update on SAP progress report. We're still working to get trial balances to work so that we can start the process of pulling together the CAFR documents. Once we've got that done and the 14th month close, which I think is tomorrow, we're sort of tentatively hoping it'll be tomorrow or by the middle of next week, then we'll start to be able to generate those documents. So I know the hope was middle of June, end of May, but I think it's reasonable to think we may go till the end of June before I have a fund balance number for you that I can give you with some certainty. I had asked if we could get a number that's plus or minus 200,000, but I think at the end we're going to have a number that'll be precisely right, and it'll be closer to the end of June.
Could you also give the Assembly a copy of the surveys coming in from the community councils? Because I'd like the Assembly to get a copy of what you're getting on the surveys from the community councils for CIP project, because sometimes they don't get them to us before it comes in front of us. And I want to know exactly what we're dealing with from each community council. I'd appreciate that. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I on those CIP surveys, I know that my community councils take them pretty seriously. I've heard them discussed several times in the last couple months. If for some reason a community council doesn't get it in time, I'm trying to remember, does it default to prior surveys? Because you have them year over year, is that correct?
We do. So honestly, in my experience, it's not been a hard deadline. And so if community councils are still inclined to provide their input after May 31st, we'll take it. And how it's integrated into the process probably depends on where we're at with it.
So a follow-up to that, another complaint I've heard from at least one community council, I'm trying to remember which one it is, maybe Pete can refresh my memory. They kept pulling the project off. They don't want the project. And
Or
then
that's every community council.
somebody keeps putting it back in, and they're sort of mystified as to who it is. So who is putting, could you answer me, like who in general is putting these projects back in? And what impact can the community council repeatedly asking you not to build it have on eventually it being removed from the capital program?
And I think that's a difficult question to answer in general. We'll do what we can to vet that process better this year and hopefully give you an answer if there are specific concerns such as that throughout the 19 development.
Okay. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In regards to bond appropriation, I understand, I think at least one bond has money for Alaska Railroad work, and it was predicated on the exclusive use easement, which I understand based on legislative action yesterday is no longer recognized by the state of Alaska. So what would happen to any money that's set aside to support those projects? Would it just be reallocated to another project, the next one on the list? Or do we intend to continue?
So, Mr. Chair, I did not know that there had been a legislative change. We'll look into it. If it is the case that the legislature has now declared that there is no exclusive use easement, it may still be that the right-of-way agreements that we have with the railroad still obligate us to make those improvements. But maybe that means it's time for a fresh look at all of those right-of-way agreements. We have a blanket permit and then specific crossings all across town, but we'll dig into that.
A quick follow-up,
Yes.
Mr. Chair.
Thanks.
And it's my understanding too that there may be maintenance contracts or agreements predicated on exclusive use as well. So if you follow that part too,
We'll do.
thank you.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Any other questions regarding 2017 to 2018 budgets before we move on to the Budget Advisory Commission? Okay, thank you guys. So I don't see Al here, Mr. Tamangi. I saw a representative of the BAC at our prior meeting, but I think he was here for the MLMP sale. So we'll move on from that. We'll go back if for some reason one of them shows up. So let's move on to everybody's favorite topic. Let's talk about SAP. Robert, you want to kick
Great.
it off?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So,
Selling that to you guys electric for a MLP sale?
So I'll talk about SAP progress and carve out payroll because I know Mr. Falsey will be talking to you about that. So I wanted to just kind of bring you up into speed on some of the mechanics of things that are going on right at the moment. Today we launched what's called a Q refresh, and what that is when we have things that we're trying to make sure work in the system or that need to be changed, we'll play with them a little bit first in an environment called the sandbox. Move that through into the development environment. Then we go into the Q environment, which in this case is a little bit old, and we're doing a refresh so that it more closely mirrors the production environment, so that when we test it in the quality environment, we know that it's going to behave just exactly as the tests indicate when we move it into production, so that we don't have something in production that doesn't work out the way we want. So that's underway right now. We sort of cut off the spigot in terms of trying to work on new fixes for the program. It just took all the ones that were sort of in progress to close. I think at the last count we closed about 95, almost close to 100 of things we were working on in the Q environment so that we could go ahead and do this Q refresh and not lose any of that work. That's going on, and it'll be a few days worth of work. As I mentioned before, we expect to have our fund balance projection sometime near the end of June. Still working on our trial balances, and once that's done, then we start working on the CAFR. We expect to have a draft CAFR ready by the end of July, as is required by our bond covenants. Again, though, the state of Alaska has sent us their draft PERS audit information, and as in the last couple of years, that didn't get to us on time for us to have a CAFR submitted on time, and so it's entirely possible that, again, that'll be the case. So I think in general, we are using SAP. We are still continuing to develop application work within it so that we can use it and it will work. As I've said before, the first time we do anything with SAP, we find things that don't work quite the way we want them to, so we log them and start working on them. And that's certainly the case here. We're working through the first CAFR, the first year in close and so forth. So we're finding things that we need to make work smoothly, and that's what we're doing.
Questions? Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Harris. So would you say then we are approaching the end of the break-fix period and entering a period of stabilization?
I think we're much, much closer to that. I think we are, I would hate to hazard a guess. I think as soon as I do, then I'm going to jinx it. But as Mr. Falsey will indicate, payroll has largely stabilized. We still have some work to do there. The one thing that's kind of ongoing right now are things for the CAFR, the year-end reports and the closeouts. And we are anticipating we'll move through those. Certainly, as we get done with the dates to deliver the draft CAFR by the end of July. So we are very, very close to this stabilization period across a number of areas. In purchasing, for example, the system's already operating reasonably stable with still some things we'd like to make better. There are still some things in the HR world, the ER world that we are still working on and need to get done. There's a much smaller list of things in the payroll world because we focused a lot of energy on that. I would say I can see the end from here as far as this initial rush of working through things the first time. Yeah, which is
Oh, yeah, sorry, Ms. LaFrance, quick follow-up and Mr. Dyson.
Okay, thank you. And then I would just add, when do you expect we will see the next request for additional funding? I'm assuming on the operational side, but perhaps it'll be capital. Maybe actually we'll get into that when we address the resolution.
Certainly. So, yeah, I think it's reasonable to expect that we're going to still need some help during the third quarter. That starts July 1st, and we won't have the CAFR done until the end of July. So there'll be something out there that as we sort of discuss within the administration and the management of SAP, what we'll need and how we'll need it and so forth. So I don't have an answer for that, but probably sometime soon. Yeah.
So actually, I want to ask, follow up to that, and I'll get to you, Mr. Dyson. So she just asked about a new funding request. Are we talking about, as we've done many times in the past, sort of shifting money from one bucket to another, talking about a new injection of funding that would raise the total project cost?
Capital versus success.
Yeah, I don't think I have an answer for that yet. I think we have a variety of options for how we would pay for this work. Certainly on a large sort of system like this, there are things you're going to do year after year, and 5 years from now, when you're still going to need to build some new feature and so forth. What that looks like for this year, I don't have an answer for that yet.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah. Is the major contractor supplier giving you support that you need?
Thank you, through the chair, Mr. Dyson. We've got an excellent group of consultants that are helping us. The bulk of them work through a company called Peloton. and they both, and then there's just a few people who are working through SAP still, but they're people that we sort of handpicked because they had been with us through the project. They know our system, they know our business, they know our people, and so, you know, I think the fact that we've been able to work rapidly, if you can think of this as rapidly, I think this is rapidly worked through to resolve a lot of the issues that we've faced. It's because we've got really good people helping us who know us and know our business and know our people. So I've been very pleased with the consultant we've been able to maintain.
So the consultant is doing a good job, but the project supplier of the system and the hardware stuff is out of the picture.
We still have maintenance agreements with SAP. In fact, I mentioned there's the Q refresh that's going on. That is through our contract with HEC, which basically has a cloud-based, server-based support of our program. So we're using their services to be able to operate this system. And as we're doing this Q refresh, what we've done is we've submitted work tickets to them. They're going ahead and they're working. So we're still getting work and support both from the software vendor as well as some of the support services the software vendor offers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think you answered my
I hope I did.
Thank you, Greg. Ms. Domboski and Mr. Croft.
When do we expect we're going to see either a fiscal range or a fiscal note related to the grievances as a result of the completion of this?
Right. I wouldn't have an answer. I would defer to Mr. Falsey for that.
And I think, the Chair, I think the answer is we're not going to know until we know. And the reason, I'm not trying to dissemble or not give you the full information, but as we talked about with the pay corrections last time, there are real core likely disagreements about when the pay correction penalties are actually triggered, and we might be very far apart with some unions about whether there are penalties to be had. And even with where there are clear paper penalties, all of those can be negotiated. And early signs, at least, are that the unions are not looking to put the municipality in a world of hurt financially either. So they will likely be looking for some meaningful response in the grievance arbitration process. But I am hopeful that it is not going to be a crushing tide of penalties that are assessed against us. But certainly we will daylight it as soon as we know what those are.
Well, I only asked, and I'm not asking for a number now because I know I won't get it, because I know you can't tell me we don't know. But my discussions with multiple union leaders has indicated that grievances have been filed. There's got to be a timeline, or at least a discussion that has been made when we're going to sit down and start to, I mean, it can't just be, oh, we don't know. I mean, I'm asking for a timeline. Do you expect it in the next 3 months, 6 months? When do we expect, is it going to be, okay, we're going to deal with it at budget time? I mean, there's got to be a timeline that you guys have, are shooting for.
There does have to be a timeline. I'm not sure that we are shooting for a particular timeline because in some ways not resolving it is only to our benefit. But the answer is that there's the step one, step two process. We're sort of going through the early phases now. The grievances are not going to be possible to totally resolve, likely, until everybody has a better handle on what has already happened. And the SAP system will hopefully help us get a better handle on that, but it's not producing those results now. And so after we get through the corrections themselves, there is going to have to be some auditing work where we just go back and say, here's what happened, here's when we corrected it, the magnitude that corrected of the correction, and here was the gap where the pay was perhaps not what it should have been. And that'll be the baseline from which we can all work. But as I understand it, that baseline has not been established by the unions, it's not been established by us yet. So we're still sort of swimming in it.
Mr. Croft.
Two questions, I guess, one from Mr. Falsey and one from Mr. Harris. Carrying on that, so the grievances are about money we didn't pay enough to our employees and how that gets resolved. There's also the other situation where we paid too much. Have we, and now they've paid taxes on those 2017 errors, have we agreed that we don't get those back?
No, through the chair, we have not. And in our discussion, I'll give you a little bit more of an update about what we're doing about the overpayment.
That's what's coming up next on the agenda?
Yes.
I didn't know the scope of that. Okay, great. And then, Mr. Harris, at one time I asked whether we had agreed, well, either one of you, I guess, not to sue SAP, and was told we have not waived that right, but we have not made that decision. Is that still the case, that we could? We've not promised not to or agreed not to?
Through the chair, I'd want to review the bidding. I know that we released Black & Veatch, the original system implementer, not once but twice.
Some administration did that, not us.
Yes, that's true. I can't recall, as I sit here now, if there are any releases in an SAP contract. But in any event, if there are, we are not foreclosed from at some point suing SAP.
Has any decision been made on whether to?
Nothing that I have to report today.
Yeah, thanks. I'll wait on the other stuff for the next agenda.
Yeah, I seem to recall us having this debate about a year ago. There was a pool of funding that SAP was going to provide us, and they were asking for exactly this kind of waiver, and we refused. So hopefully that wormed its way in somehow, I think. I doubt it did. Any other questions on this before we go on to pay corrections?
Mr. Chairman, can I just make a kind of a preview of coming attractions comment before we get into bills? But I think, as most of you know, one of the things that we are working very diligently on is trying to figure out what does the long-term internal structure of SAP look like within the municipality, so that we don't have to rely on outside consultants forever to help that. As a part of that process, we have kind of looked at what other municipalities have done as they have matured in their SAP, what other innovative municipalities have done. One of the things that we have found is a lot of them have created essentially a chief technology office department that houses IT, SAP, and in some circumstances a number of other kind of smaller offices that are throughout the municipality. So we are looking at bringing forward a potential reorganization where we create this office so that it has a direct report to the mayor. So there's increased visibility both from the IT world and the SAP world directly to the mayor and his senior team. So I would expect sometime over the next 3 or 4 weeks that we will begin having more substantive conversations with you all about what that looks like.
Thank you, Mr. Buckenstead. Mr. Trainee?
Sir, is that because our IT director's gone now?
So it is not. I think what
Are they here or they leave?
What's that?
Is he still here or did he leave?
He resigned a couple weeks ago, and we actually have the new acting IT director, Susie Marshall, here. So I think part of this has just been a process that we've gone through to try to figure out what does this organization look like. Not just 6 months from now, but 5 years from now.
Susie, nice to meet you. Do you have any relative experience with SAP? Have you done it with us since you worked with SAP at?
I have implemented a different ERP system.
But not SAP.
But not SAP. But
Well, you have a lot of reading to do.
yes.
Thank you, ma'am. You answered my question.
Great.
Mr. Cons?
Thank you and welcome aboard, Susie. Just to understand what I just heard you say, you said you're going to be coming forward in a month or so to talk about restructuring the IT department under maybe an officer position. Is that coming with a fiscal note?
Not clear right now. At this point, we'd be looking at creating one new position that would be on the same level as the CFO and the municipal manager. I think there are some things that we can do to make sure that it is budget neutral. Creating this, but then outside of that, it'd be just essentially moving the IT department that is already funded and SAP, and potentially some other offices underneath there.
Mr. Trainee just whispered in my ear that position would be confirmed then.
by the assembly.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Buckenstein. So at this time, let's move on to Mr. Falsey's portion of the SAP question, and that's the scope and status of pay correction liability.
Okay, so I'll give you an update with charts. I was before this group in March, I believe, when I gave you the payroll corrections story. And I'm just going to refresh the charts I gave you last time with a little bit more color commentary. So I'll show you what I showed you before. You will recall that I said we had 3 windows into what is going on with payroll and what has gone on with payroll. The first window is how many physical pieces of paper, pay corrections, are being submitted into payroll of people saying something went wrong. And in the old PeopleSoft world, we used to get 50 to 80 a month, and then we turned on SAP, and we got slightly more, as you can tell. The good news at the time in March was that it looked like it was stabilizing, and so now I will take you to today with the updated data. It does look like it has stabilized. I will say this is a good news but not great news story, because it is stabilized at a level which is higher than the old PeopleSoft era. And there are a couple reasons for that, I think. So first, in the old PeopleSoft era, we were looking between 50 and 80. Now, remember, we're only halfway through May, so we're closer to about 200. It's a more manageable level, but it's still not what it should be. We should be at least as good as the old system. Why is the number still high? We are getting our arms around that, but I think there's a couple reasons. One is that there is some number of corrections that we used to be able to catch in Telestaff, Teledriver, the time systems that are at transit, fire, and police before they hit payroll. And we have not been quite as good as catching those before they hit payroll in this era, because everyone has been scrambling. So some of them are leaking through in a way that we would have caught back in the old day. I think that might actually be a minor effect. The bigger effect is there are a number of known pay correction defects that we have requested fixes for, but which have not yet been pushed into the system. So we are generating repeated errors that we know are errors and that we know how to fix, and that we are just waiting for the fix to come through. So I think the good news story is we're down much lower than we used to be. The worst is behind us. We are stabilizing. And the forward-looking, hopefully good news story is that number should shrink and stabilize at something much closer, or even hopefully, ideally, below the old PeopleSoft number. We're not there yet. We'll give you more updates when we continue to do this meeting.
Mr. Falsey, 1 second. You guys want to wait till the end of the presentation? Or
I want to ask a question relative to this.
Mr. Trainee and Mr. Constant.
Mr. Falsey, 105. You're saying those are frequent flyers. They're not just solved and they're gone. They keep cropping up because they're not fixing the problem. Who is responsible for fixing that problem? Is it SAP or is it our contractors?
So I don't know. I can't give you an order of magnitude of how many of the 200 a month are known problems that are continuing to happen every single time. But there is some number of those. And the process is we get in the incoming pay corrections, and I'll use a concrete example. And I don't even know if this was a defect, but this is a good toy model. We get a bunch of pay corrections in, and everybody says, I was supposed to get a boot allowance. We go, oh, the system was not configured to pay a boot allowance. So we put the pay corrections down, we process them, we say we're not going to write checks for boots, we're going to let the system retro a boot allowance to everyone, and the process for that is payroll figures out that there was a system problem, we hand it off to the SAP consultant who may hand it off to a developer. And at the end of the development process, we put it into this environment that Robert was describing, it gets quality assessed, it goes into development, it moves into production, then it retros out and it's out of our lives. There are some number of paid defects that are still somewhere in that SAP developer QA development production pipeline. And when they get through, they'll retroactively correct a bunch of pay corrections which have been in the system, and they will stop generating errors going forward. But the system is still shaky. We're still seeing new errors as much as we're seeing repeated old errors as we step into new different kinds of things. So we're switching into summer season now. So we have a whole suite of summer seasonal schedules that the system has never seen before. Some of them are rocky. So as the the traffic guys are spending their nights painting crosswalks and putting bike lanes back on the street. Those schedules have never run through SAP until previously, and it turns out that some of them were not configured correctly. So this whole system is a little shaky until we do everything once, and I think we're going to continue to see something like that as we move forward.
My only concern, Mr. Falls, is I don't want this old one here, which was the norm at that time. I don't want this to become the norm here, where we accept 100 to 200 as a normal under
Right.
this new system.
We
That
also
doesn't
do
work.
not want to have invested a significant amount of money to have a system which is materially underperforming as compared to what we had before we
But
started.
we did hire SAP, but thank you, sir.
Okay, so that was the first window into what is going on in payroll, what has happened in payroll.
It was pretty close to the same question. Really, was a result of
Mr. Croft, do you want to ask it now or later?
Very briefly, so you're using that example, so then we continue to generate these boot allowance corrections, even though it's in the process of being made, but still every pay period the boot is popping up as a thing. Just using that example, how much of the 200 steady state is sort of known and working on stuff versus new stuff?
I don't have a handle on that, so I can't give you an answer to that. And I'll say boot allowance is actually not a bad example because I think that's a one-time-a-year kind of event. There are some APD shift differential ones and some leave cash-out ones, and we know that those are kind of happening every time, and we know there are fixes in the work. I don't know if Ona or Jason has a better handle on that.
I think it's a combination of both, as Bill was saying. There's some things that are happening that are user error, and there have historically, as you can see, been user error throughout the way Telestaff and Teledriver in particular speak to whatever the program that processes the payroll is. So you have an officer input something wrong and it goes across because APD payroll didn't catch it before it got translated. So that can be anything from comp time to some sort of leave issue to a boot allowance. So they're not necessarily a lot of one thing, as there can be many of various things. The boot allowances, the meal additions, things like that, APD has been doing a really spectacular job at catching before it gets to SAP. So there are some, I don't think we can call it historical now at this point, historical issues that keep running up. But APD is catching quite a few of them, and we aren't stopping and just letting them slide through. The goal is to make sure that APD payroll and all the other payroll departments are not spending the majority of their time fixing things before it gets to the SAP system, but that the interface between their program and SAP is actually accurate. And to answer Mr. Trainey's question, there are 3 different groups of people who are working on fixing all of these things. We have our internal specialists, we have the consultants who are working on the development of it, and then there are some other people who have experience on both sides of it who are trying to sort out the translation between the two. So I think as we sort of smash these down as time goes on, there will be more and more ability to focus on these outstanding ones instead of the ones that were easy to knock off. And so the goal is to just make sure that these aren't happening in perpetuity.
Mr. Peterson, then I'm going to ask Mr. Falsey to continue with this presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Oh, my goodness. So we're still making errors, and the unions have it in their contract that they can penalize us for that, and we don't know how much that is going to be. So we find ourselves in a precarious situation looking at next year's budget if we don't have any idea of how much the union is going to come back and say that we owe them for errors. Does anybody have any ideas on how we can prepare for that?
Probably Mr. Falsey might.
Well, our first order of response is get it fixed and working as fast as possible, and then address all the pay corrections that came in, get everybody paid the way they were supposed to be paid, and then we'll have to sit down and have a series of conversations with each of the unions, and we try to come to some reasonable resolution. Like I said in the prior portion of the agenda, I really do think, at least in the current stage, that there is goodwill on both sides. People realize that we have turned on a brand new system, that we are in this unique time period. I don't think any of the unions are looking to decimate any of the department budgets, because they know that if extra money goes to the union members, it's got to come out of something else, and they all work here too, and they all live in this city. So I think we're just going to have to work through it. And the best answer I can give you then is that this remains sort of a top level priority that we're having regular updates on, and getting extra resources in the first quarter budget revision to expand the number of people in payroll, to pay more overtime so we can get on top of this and someday get this in the rear view mirror and focus on things that people actually care about, like police, fire, parks, and roads.
One slight help, if I might. Thank you. So we lost our previous IT director. Did that have anything to do with SAP?
Well, I don't know how to comment on that. Zal, our previous IT director, resigned. I suppose we'd have to get into his head. But
Wondering if anybody got burned out trying to figure out how to fix this. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr.
okay,
Falsey,
so I said when I made this presentation 2 months ago that we had 3 ways into what's happening in payroll. The first was the paper forms that people are submitting. The second 2 ways were outputs from SAP. Well, going backwards, I'm sorry. Hold on, here we go. I don't know why I'm moving backwards. Oh, because I got on that. There we go. Outputs from SAP itself, and those came in 2 forms: the underpayments and the overpayments. So when we actually push something into the system, it says, "System, you have been calculating shift differential incorrectly." It goes back and says, "Oh, had I been configured that way since September 11th, I would have paid people in a different manner." And this was the output on the overpayment side back last month. I do have to apologize. The new graph I'm going to show you is by month and not by biweekly pay period, so the graphs will look a little bit different, but the story is effectively the same. We are generating very, very few overpayments per month now, so this is a pretty good news story. The system has identified that if it was configured from the beginning the way it is now, it would not have paid out this amount of money. We have not gone back to recoup any of this money yet, but looping back to the earlier conversation, we do believe we're owed this money back. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. By contrast, the system also realizes when it's underpaid people, and we have gone back and said, well, you got to go pay those people. And so we have cleared all of these underpayments. And the updated version is a version of the same story we had last time. The system is underpaying at a much smaller level than it was previously. We have already cleared all of these. There were weird year-end effects, which largely had to do with leave cash outs. And there were February effects, which was the federal tax bill that changed a lot of deductions, so we had to catch up with those. But these have all been recouped. And then aside from the 3 windows into the system, we also gave you a flavor for each of the unions last time. I won't go through all the bargaining agreements again, but I'll just remind you that these charts do exist, and then use that to talk about recouping overpayments. So originally this was the volume incoming pay corrections. You'll see it's largely a police and fire story. That's partly because
over or under or both?
these are just, this is first window, this is people said you paid me wrong, one way or the other, which is probably biased towards underpayments, right? Not a lot of necessarily
Complaints.
people who are complaining about you.
Right.
Also tracks the municipality. We are mostly police and fire employees if you look at the total number of FTEs. The updated version, not much has changed. The bars are a little bit higher because time has passed. And same on the underpayments. This was the old story. Time passes, the bars are still in the same proportions. They're a little bit higher because time has passed. And finally, the overpayments, same proportions, time has passed. The vast majority of the overpayments are police officers, in fact, sworn patrol at APDEA. We think that the system is stabilized enough now that it is time to start engaging in the question of what to do about the overpayments seriously. So we have gone to APDEA and said we would like to start recouping some of the overpayments. We took a list of the top most overpaid folks. I think we generated a list of the top 20. There are some folks who ended up with $16,000 more than they were supposed to have, for instance. And we are working with the union to pilot, maybe we'll pick 10 of those 20 and we'll see if we can get that money back, and we'll test it. We'll make sure everybody has clear visibility into what is happening. No one is surprised. The repayments do not generate any hardship for anyone, and we'll see if we can build a system that we could then replicate so that we can start recouping some of this money. And that's going to happen in relatively short order. I don't have a...
Just on that, the question I wanted to get to before, Mr. Chairman, just real quick, is has any union, but it particularly it looks like the police or fire, taken the position that you are no longer entitled to 2017 overtime?
Not to my knowledge, no. And no, I think the answer is just no.
Mr. Trainee?
Mr. Folsey, would you get with our chairman to identify those people that are in the assembly that are overpaid or underpaid, so the chairman knows ahead of time and talk to individuals if we've got a problem with them?
Is that in dollars or?
This is
$250?
This is dollars. So there is $1 million that's up with APEA. There's $250 that someone has in their assembly
Just
pocket.
let the chairman know so he knows ahead of time.
Pretty
Of
sure
course, you need to know.
Pretty sure it's thick.
I will say that there's some amount of time to pass before we come to that. I think we're
I'm sure
prioritizing. Recouping the overpayments, we are piloting with APD because we think that we might be able to process a lot of overpayments, and it is material. It's a lot of money that affected their budget. But this is the lowest priority work. I mean, we are still trying to process the underpayments. We're still trying to fix the system. And then the same payroll and ER folks who are working on all this have other jobs. They are supposed to also be working on our labor union contracts and processing all of these grievances and getting payroll out every 2 weeks. So this is the lowest priority. We're just dipping our toe into it now. Mostly I wanted to let you know that we haven't lost the thread of this and that it won't always escape attention. I don't have a chart for this last item, but there was the initial slug of pay corrections. I'm looking for updated figures from payroll, but my rough understanding is that about half of the pay corrections that we have received since September are now either finished or in what they call partial status. The partial status is the ER payroll work is done. The solution is not to cut a check. The solution is to put system defect correction in, and that will retro it all, but it means that folks haven't necessarily been paid yet. So we're about halfway through the pay correction backlog. Another quarter or a third may already be finished because we assembled the war room. We brought in payroll specialists from all corners of the municipality, and they got through the stacks. So we had Vivian and APD who brought barrels of papers, and she submitted all her results to payroll in a spreadsheet form. Payroll is now doing the verification on those. So these also may be done, but there's a good chunk, 25%, 33%, that's in payroll to do that verification work, and the rest remains in some kind of progress form. I'm hopeful that the next time that we do this, I can give you some better sense of that and declare at some point that the whole backlog has been processed. But that's where we are today. We're making progress. It's more stable than it used to be. It's not as good as we would like yet, but we are working on it.
So I'm going to ask, I had a chance to meet with someone from the IBEW on this topic, and they showed me a letter that had a long list of their assertions, and this person was in leadership and described that they are feeling a lot of pressure from their membership now because some of the penalty pay has sort of stacked up to such a great degree, and we're talking thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of dollars in some cases with pay corrections and penalty pay. So I guess my question to you is, have you received this letter, and when was the last time you met with IBEW specifically? Because they were, I think, number 3rd on your list, but they're not police or fire. They have a smaller number of employees, and so they're a little bit different relationship with us than our police and fire union. So when was the last time you met with the IBEW, and what are the status of those specific grievances that they have?
I suspect we received the letter. I have not personally seen or received the letter. That would be a Karen Norsworthy, Maya Rankin ER question. They're not here today. I think it's Karen's birthday, actually. She might be out. I can certainly find out that answer. We are meeting with IBEW all of the time on a whole variety of issues related to MLP sale, other amendments that you're seeing on the Assembly agenda coming through on May 22nd. I don't know when the last time we specifically met on pay corrections is, but it would not have been a long time ago. It would have been recently.
Do you have any to add to that, Ona?
No, I haven't seen that letter, and the few conversations that we've had with IBEW's legal team haven't been specifically about that issue.
Okay. I mean, the primary assertion of this letter was there was still a very large number of outstanding issues, and they didn't feel there had been a lot of progress made since October.
Oh, and I should mention that. As I mentioned last time, one of the other things that we have not done particularly well is convey back to people both the progress that we're making and how we have actually addressed their individual corrections. So in that first slug, when the payroll corrections were coming in at $1,000 a month in a way that they'd never come before, there really was not a great process in place. People were sending in their payroll corrections and not getting a lot of communication back from payroll. And then, as I mentioned before, the system, when it retros payments, when it trues up the underpayments, has some codes on the second page of your pay stub, which we call the pay advice. And that has just not been configured well, so that for many months you would get extra money in your paycheck without a clear understanding of how it related to the pay correction you submitted or to how the system generated the result that it's actually giving you, which is also part of the reason why there's this future audit to come where we make sure everything is trued up. So I think it is not unreasonable at all that there would be a sentiment that folks don't know that we are making a level of progress or that their particular situations have been effectively handled. And I know that because I think both our internal communications were not very good, and the system that was the results, the communication that was coming out of the pay stub was not good. We've recognized that as issues, so the new protocol that we've put in place is to be much more transparent with communications from payroll back to people who are submitting the pay corrections. We got your pay correction, we're working on your pay correction, we finished your pay correction, and we put a lot of resources in trying to fix the second page of the pay advice, and ultimately we were spending so much effort on that we realized that we probably should just switch courses and use the default pay stubs that the SAP system is capable of generating that don't really look like the old PeopleSoft pay stub. Hopefully that'll be better. So all of which is to say, I think those two stories that you're hearing are both true, and they're also
Can I ask a quick follow-up? Well, I'm going to ask a quick follow-up. So I heard something about the tip line, that like the line on the pay stub that says tips for some of our employees, where they were seeing a portion of their pay there but they don't receive tips. Is this not something you've heard?
I haven't heard that.
Okay. The number wasn't wrong, but for some reason it was being reported as tips, a portion of their pay. Yeah.
So,
all right, Mr. Constant.
Yeah, if we have a long list of people that are either underpaid or overpaid, there are probably some that are both. And I think that it would be wise to contemplate looking at those individuals as an opportunity to kind of break through some of these arguments about debts to the union because of failed pay opportunities. Like, let's come up with a way to watch this, so you guys drop your claims and we eat the loss. So I think it would be wise to look at that list for who's on both.
Any other questions? Mr. France?
Just a quick comment to the point about perception and what you mentioned, Mr. Dunbar. I mean, I also was contacted by a member of union leadership who said, at what point is the union going to give up on SAP because it's not working? So that sentiment is definitely out there.
I mean, isn't the answer that we cannot? It is basically impossible for us to give up on SAP. Mr. Trainee.
As they told us, our old contractor, he said, once you're in this road, you can't get out of it. And that's the reason SAP likes selling this to organizations like ours. Because you're so far into it, there's no way to pull out of it. We've got to make this thing work because we've got, $85 million of this approximately. And if you go back over the system, like the original study done said take PeopleSoft and enhance it, put updates on it, go ahead. Lucinda Mahoney didn't want to do that. She ended up picking SAP. Boy, trained to this, there's no way out of it, man. Because you've lost the money. It's lost money.
Quick follow-up. I'm not suggesting we necessarily abandon that because from what you just presented, Mr. Falsey, it sounds like we're on the right track, but at the very least there is a perception issue and a definite lack of confidence in the system.
And I'll say payroll is just one window into that. So if you were to pull up my SAP interface, you'll see right across the top something like 19 different tabs, all of these different modules, and it does not feel like an $85 million experience. It is not a user-friendly system, and so just to do simple tasks is still taking a lot of care and feeding and a lot of training. And part of that is just anything that's new. Folks have to get the new manual. We have to write the manual. It doesn't come with the manual. And we have to socialize that. Part of it is just still a very cumbersome interface now. And so I think in some ways Mr. Trainee quoting Zig was right. We realized the only way out was through. We're going to have to get there. We're committed to getting there. But it is not at all surprising to me to hear people expressing frustrations.
Mr. Trainee, and then let's move on to the discussion, very related discussion on the resolution.
As they told us, I agree, he said, some programs are written for your application. He says, this one is written for SAP, and you have to conform your way of doing business to their model, which is what we're doing. Rather than work with us, the system work with us, we're conforming how we behave to match the system. Different ways of doing it.
Like an army boot. All right, so on to number 8 on our agenda, AR 2017-274. Is there someone specifically who wants to speak about this? Is this something that the administration wants to speak about, or something that a member of the assembly put on there?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With being about 8 or 9 months into the transition, it seemed like a good time to revisit the resolution that Mr. Rivera had put forth and we voted on in August. And at the time, we had asked for weekly updates post-go live, and then a few other items in section 2, establishing the stabilization period and the capital project, cost audit, performance audits. And my question to the body would be, should we be continuing with weekly updates? Should we be following up on the items we requested in section 2? Is this not the right time? Or should we revise our request? And so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Plan. So we no longer have a Zico contract. Would the administration comment on section 2, and are these things that we are all doing? Establishing an SAP solution stabilization period, for example. Are these things we are doing or have done?
I don't. Oh, thank you.
It's attached to the agenda.
Okay. Oh, thanks. So let me see if I can take an initial answer at section 2. In large measure, the first piece, establishing an SAP solution stabilization period, is something that we have been in and have been working through. So, and part of that has been driven by the question of what is stabilization and how we're going to know when we get there. I think in some ways you've seen information from payroll that says, we're sort of back down to some sort of steady state number where it's somewhat on par with what we saw before with PeopleSoft, and sort of indicating that we're getting towards a stabilization there. And as we go through the first of the year-end close and the first of the CAFR, we're going to get a better sense about how having the system work to get us to that stabilization period. So we have been constantly asking ourselves, what does stabilization look like and how are we going to get there? Recognizing, of course, that trying to predict what that period would look like at the onset has proven to be challenging, and so rather than try to say we think we're going to hit the end date on June 30th, we've simply continued to work and to identify problems when they're there, prioritize them, and either start working on them right away or defer them. The new initiation of a new capital project to assess SAP solution extensions, Synergy 2, that was Zig's idea about the sort of what's next question. And that is something I think that the administration's working on, and as Jason mentioned, I think we'll be bringing back an idea about what's going to happen, what's next. Certainly, the SAP project cost audit and the SAP performance project performance audit are both things that I think folks haven't necessarily taken a look at least I'm not aware of, but are certainly well within the realm of things we could do as we sort of look back into the rearview mirror to decide, where we're at on things. And it looks like Ona has something to chime in on.
I'm under the impression that BDO actually has done the minimum or performance audit on SAP. They finished it, I think, within the last month or so, so we should be seeing some information come back from that, and we will be able to show that we have it. I don't know to what extent the cost audit is included in that, but that is something that we're going to be working on as we go through the next 2 months, 6 weeks, trying to figure out what we're doing, what the next steps are, and it'll involve a look back, particularly with the help of Susie, to make sure that what we have done so far for our benefit and our purposes doesn't have any holes in it, and we'll be able to share that information with you.
Thank you, Una. So, I guess if Mr. France wants to follow up on this, or Mr. Trainee wants to comment, we passed this resolution. We asked for weekly updates. We got weekly updates. We did it through Go Live and for some time thereafter. But there's no expiration date on this resolution, right? And there's no. So in theory, we are still in the post-Go Live phase, although everything is post-Go Live, right? So, I don't know, does anyone have a sense of, do we want to go back to weekly updates on SAP? Training?
I think the most of us are getting now as part of this committee is a good time. Because there's no way, you can't go back in time, we have what we've got. So I appreciate the monthly updates. Should we grind this thing down to where it's acceptable? I know I ran the military's IT on Alameda. We had weekly meetings on defects. We would chart every defect that was called in and where it was and getting it fixed. So we knew where it was. I don't know if you guys are doing that here now. Because you need to know where the defect's at and where it's coming back to being fixed.
Right.
Hope you're doing that.
Through the chair, Mr. Trainee, yes, we do that. We have weekly meetings where we are both tracking defects and discussing them, making sure that it hasn't fallen off the screen, that people are working on it, they know it's being worked, and who's working on it, and what municipal resources are required to get that moving through.
Thank you, sir. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. France, do you have any comments on this?
No, my example is just to check in on the status, since as you pointed out, Mr. Dunbar, there was no end date indicated, and also to get a status, especially on the cost audit, performance audit. Thank you for that information.
Wonderful. Okay, well, we have 2 minutes left. Do we have time for any other comments from my colleagues or audience participation? Is there anyone here from the BAC? Did they ever send somebody? No. Okay, well, let's close this, then we'll move on to the work session.